You know that really terrifying feeling when you're just swimming in the ocean and you think you're perfectly safe?
Oh, yeah. Ignorance is bliss right up until it isn't.
Right. You're just treading water, enjoying the sun. But then you turn around to look at the beach and you realize your beach towel is like a mile down the coastline.
It's the worst feeling in the world.
It really is. Because you haven't been swimming away from it. You haven't been actively, trying to leave. But underneath you, this quiet, invisible rip current has just been pulling you out.
Oh, yeah.
And by the time you actually notice it, you are in serious, serious danger. And, well, that terrifying realization of being pulled by an invisible current, that is exactly what the original readers of the Epistle to the Hebrews were experiencing.
That is a perfect analogy for this. They were absolutely caught in a current.
Yeah, so welcome to this deep dive, everyone. Today we're jumping into a really rigorous seminary-level survey of a book that was written to people who were quite literally drifting toward disaster.
Yeah, they were.
It's just a masterclass in theology, and it was forged in an absolute pressure cooker of a historical moment.
It really is the definition of a text written on the brink. I mean, we are dealing with an ancient congregation that is facing immense, crushing pressure.
Right, and it's not like they're just outwardly rebelling, right?
Exactly. They aren't necessarily running away from their faith in some, dramatic display of rebellion. They are just being worn down by this relentless cultural and political current.
Which is so relatable, honestly.
It is. And the author of Hebrews, who is essentially preaching this soaring, majestic sermon to them, well, they recognize that the only way to stop that drift is to drop an anchor.
Drop an anchor. I love that.
Yeah, and that anchor is the absolute, unquestionable supremacy of Jesus Christ. That's the whole point.
So to really grasp the brilliance of this sermon, we first have to understand the people it was written to and the mind that wrote it. But, the very first thing you hit when you open the book of Hebrews is this massive mystery.
Oh, the elephant in the room.
The huge elephant.
Right.
Because you read Romans or Corinthians, and the very first word is Paul. You get the customary greetings. You get grace and peace to the church and wherever.
It's a standard letter format.
But you open Hebrews, and it just, bam, it launches straight into the deepest theology imaginable.
Yeah.
There's no name. There's no return address. Just the voice.
It's wild. It's a deliberate choice by their author. And historically, it has driven biblical scholars absolutely crazy.
I can imagine. So what did the early church think?
Well, early Eastern church tradition leaned pretty heavily toward the Apostle Paul. In fact, some of the really early manuscript collections, they just grouped Hebrews right in with Paul's undisputed letters to churches like Rome or Ephesus.
I've always heard that the Greek in Hebrews makes the Paul theory a really tough sell, though, like linguistically.
Oh, it's a very tough sell.
Yeah.
It's practically a different linguistic universe. The vocabulary, the rhetorical devices, the overall cadence, it is strikingly different from Paul's known writings.
How so? Because Paul is pretty brilliant himself.
Oh, Paul's Greek is powerful, and it's passionate, but it can be rugged, He invents words. He goes on these long, winding theological tangents where he almost loses his train of thought.
Yeah, those famous Pauline run-on sentences.
Exactly. But the author of Hebrews, they write with some of the most elegant, polished, sophisticated Greek in the entire New Testament. It flows with a rhythm that feels incredibly highly educated.
So if we take Paul out of the suspect lineup, who are we left with? Who had the education and, the theological chops to write something this profound?
There are a few very compelling candidates based on internal clues from the text itself. First, there's Apollos.
Okay, Apollos. What's the case for him?
Well, we know from the book of Acts that Apollos was an eloquent Alexandrian Jew. And Alexandria, down in Egypt, was a massive center of ancient learning and philosophy.
They had the great library there.
Exactly. And Acts specifically says Apollos was mighty in the scriptures. He knew the Old Testament backward and forward, and he knew how to argue from it.
Which is exactly what Hebrews does.
Precisely. That perfectly aligns with the intense, sophisticated Old Testament focus we see in Hebrews.
Apollos makes a lot of sense, the Alexandrian connection especially, because Hebrews uses a lot of philosophical language like talking about shadows versus substance.
Yes, that Platonic framework.
Right. And that feels very, very at home in Alexandrian thought. Who else is on the short list?
Barnabas is a fascinating possibility.
Barnabas. Okay, why him?
Well, he was a Levite from Cyprus, and being a Levite means he would have had intimate insider knowledge of the priestly and sacrificial systems.
Oh, that's a great point. And Hebrews spends chapters obsessing over the details of the tabernacle and the priesthood.
Exactly. Furthermore, his name literally translates to son of encouragement. And in chapter 13, the author explicitly calls this entire letter a word of exhortation or a word of encouragement.
Okay, that is a really cool connection. And I suppose Luke is usually thrown in there too, right? Just based on the sheer quality of the Greek.
Yeah, exactly. The linguistic style in Hebrews shares some undeniable similarities with the really refined classical Greek of the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts.
I have to play the skeptic for a second, though, for the listener.
Sure, go for it.
Because if we genuinely don't know who wrote this, like if we are just tossing around names like Apollos, Barnabas, and Luke, doesn't that create a problem for its authority?
It's a valid question.
Right. Because from a conservative evangelical perspective, if I can't point to an apostle and say, he wrote this under divine inspiration, why is it sitting in my Bible between Philemon and James?
It's a vital question, and it's one the early church wrestled with extensively. But, evangelical confidence in Hebrews doesn't rest on having a verifiable signature at the bottom of the papyrus.
What does it rest on then?
It rests on two main things: its apostolic association and its canonicity.
Unpack that apostolic association part for me. You mean the author was, like, running in the same circles as the apostles?
Exactly that. Just look at chapter 13, verse 23. The author explicitly mentions Timothy. They say, "I want you to know that our brother Timothy has been released. If he arrives soon, I will come with him to see you."
Oh, wow. And Timothy was Paul's most trusted protege?
Right. So whoever this anonymous author is, they are operating directly within the inner apostolic circle. They carry the theological weight and the endorsement of the early church's leadership.
So they were definitely a known and trusted leader.
Absolutely. But ultimately, the 3rd century church father Origen summed up the authorship debate perfectly when he concluded, "Who wrote the epistle? In truth, God only knows."
God only knows. I love that. There's something deeply theological about that anonymity, isn't there? It almost forces you to look past the human instrument.
It really does. It shifts your gaze entirely. I mean, the very first verse of the book says God spoke. It doesn't say, "I, Paul, am speaking," or "I, Apollos, am speaking."
Right. The focus is entirely on God.
Yeah, the anonymity demands that the reader focus on the Holy Spirit as the ultimate author speaking through the text.
So we don't have a name. But we do get to play detective when it comes to when this masterpiece was written. And there is a massive historical clue hidden right in plain sight.
It's the classic Sherlock Holmes scenario. The dog that didn't bark in the night.
It really is. Because the author spends a massive chunk of this letter, multiple chapters, dissecting the Levitical sacrificial system.
In meticulous detail.
Right. They talk about the tabernacle, the high priest going behind the curtain, the daily sacrifices of bulls and goats, and they describe all of this in the present tense.
That's the key right there.
Yeah, they talk about it as an ongoing, functioning, daily reality, which is wild when you think about the history.
Which is incredibly telling because we know exactly what happened in the year 70 AD.
The Romans happened.
The Romans happened. The Roman Empire, under Titus, laid a brutal siege to Jerusalem. They breached the walls, they slaughtered the inhabitants, and they utterly leveled the temple. The whole thing was destroyed.
Not just a little damage. Total annihilation.
Total. The entire Jewish sacrificial system came to a violently abrupt, catastrophic end. The altar was destroyed, the priesthood was scattered or killed. It was over.
So if the author of Hebrews is trying to convince these Jewish Christians that the old sacrificial system is obsolete and that Jesus is the final ultimate sacrifice,
yeah.
The destruction of the temple in 70 AD would be the ultimate mic drop argument. They could just say, look out the window. The temple is a pile of smoking rubble. God has clearly shut the system down.
It would end the debate instantly. But the author never mentions it. There isn't a single hint that the temple has fallen or that the sacrifices have ceased.
That silence is just deafening.
It's deafening to historians and biblical scholars alike. It firmly, absolutely anchors the composition of Hebrews before 70 AD. Most conservative scholarship places it in the mid to late 60s AD, roughly between 64 and 68 AD.
Meaning, this book is written right on the razor's edge of absolute historical catastrophe.
Exactly.
Because the First Jewish-Roman War erupted in 66 AD. Rome and Judea are literally on a collision course. So this church is existing in a very specific, very volatile window of time.
A terrifying window.
Let's talk about them. Where are they? And what exactly is this pressure that's making them drift?
Well, the textual clues point strongly to a community of Jewish Christians living in Rome.
How do we know that?
At the very end of the letter, the author says, "Those from Italy send you their greetings."
Ah, okay. That's a Pretty solid hint.
Yeah. And we aren't talking about a massive, wealthy congregation meeting in some huge basilica. We were talking about small, intimate house churches. And to understand the psychological terror they are living under, we have to look at the primary historical sources of the era.
What was life actually like for a Jewish Christian in Rome in the mid-60s?
It was incredibly precarious. I mean, the Roman historian Suetonius records that back in 49 AD, the Emperor Claudius essentially expelled all Jews from Rome.
Just a mass eviction.
Mass eviction. And Suetonius says it was due to constant disturbances at the instigation of a figure he calls Chrestus, which is almost universally recognized by historians as a Latin misspelling of Christ.
Wow. So the early Christian message was causing riots in the Jewish synagogues of Rome.
Exactly. It was causing such an uproar that Claudius just kicked everyone out.
So this community reading Hebrews has already experienced the trauma of forced exile. I mean, imagine that. One day you have a business and a home in Rome, and the next day the emperor kicks you out just for being Jewish and believing in Jesus.
Yes, and though they eventually trickled back into the city after Claudius died, they walk right into a complete nightmare. Nero. In 64 AD, the Great Fire of Rome breaks out. Half the city burns to the ground. The populace is furious. They're looking for someone to blame. And the Emperor Nero needs a scapegoat to deflect the blame from himself.
Right, because there were rumors he started it.
Exactly. So he targets this obscure new religious sect, the Christians.
And the descriptions of what Nero did to them, I mean, they are horrifying.
They are. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote about it in really visceral detail. Now, Tacitus despised Christians. He literally called the faith a mischievous superstition. But even he seemed repulsed by Nero's cruelty.
What did he do?
Nero didn't just execute them quietly. He made a spectacle of it. He had them covered in the skins of wild beasts and torn apart by dogs. He had them nailed to crosses.
Good grief.
It gets worse. He had them covered in pitch and set on fire to serve as human torches for his garden parties at night.
You can't even fathom the psychological trauma of knowing that could happen to your family at any moment.
Yeah.
You're just trying to live your life, go to your house church, and that's the thread hanging over you.
And meanwhile, the Jewish historian Josephus tells us that back in Judea, intense Jewish nationalism is boiling over, which is leading straight into full-blown war with Rome.
It's just a powder keg everywhere.
Exactly. So put yourself in the shoes of a Jewish Christian in Rome in 65 AD. The Roman Empire recognized Judaism as a religio illicita, a legal, protected religion.
Meaning they had rights.
Right. If you were a traditional synagogue-attending Jew, Rome generally left you alone. You were exempt from having to offer sacrifices to the emperor or the Roman gods. You had a legal shield.
But Christianity is starting to be recognized as something distinct from Judaism at this point. It's losing that umbrella of protection.
Exactly. It's becoming an illegal, unprotected superstition in the eyes of the state.
So these believers in this house church, they're looking out their windows of their traditional Jewish neighbors.
Yeah.
Those neighbors are going to the synagogue on the Sabbath. They have the legal protection of the state. They aren't getting thrown to the dogs. They aren't getting their property seized.
That's the contrast, and the author of Hebrews explicitly reminds this congregation that in the past they had endured public exposure to insult and persecution, confiscation of property, and imprisonment.
They've already lost so much.
Yeah.
And that is exactly where the rip current happens.
Yeah.
If I'm one of those believers, I'm exhausted. I'm traumatized.
You're just trying to survive.
Right. I might not wake up one morning and say, I hate Jesus, I'm abandoning the faith. That's too dramatic. But I might think, well, God understands my situation. What if I just quietly go back to the synagogue?
Just for a little while.
Yeah. I'll still believe in Jesus in my heart, but outwardly, I'll participate in the old covenant rituals. I'll get that legal protection of Judaism back. I'll keep my kids safe. I'll keep my house.
They are being tempted to drift back to the shadows because the shadows are safe. The visible, tangible rituals of the Old Covenant offer political and physical security.
And following Jesus doesn't.
Following the invisible, crucified Messiah offers a cross. That is the pastoral crisis of this book.
So if you are the pastor of this terrified, drifting flock, how do you even address that? You can't just send them a list of rules. You can't just send an email saying, stop drifting, it's a sin.
No, guilt won't work on people that exhausted.
You have to capture their imagination. You have to remind them of the absolute staggering majesty of what they possess in Christ.
Because the medium is the message. The genre of Hebrews is vital to understand here. It is not a standard Greco-Roman letter like we talked about.
Right. So what is it?
It functions as a Christian homily, a sermonic epistle. It's essentially a brilliant, meticulously crafted sermon that has been written down to be read aloud to the congregation.
Okay, that changes how you read it entirely.
It does. It blends the persuasive, logical techniques of Greco-Roman rhetoric with the deep, text-based traditions of Jewish synagogue preaching.
So if this is a sermon, how did the pastor actually organize it? Because it's long. Are they just bouncing around randomly between angels and Moses and animal sacrifices?
Not at all. The macro structure is incredibly deliberate, and it builds continuously. It basically operates in 3 major movements.
Walk us through those movements.
Chapters 1 through 4 focus intensely on the superiority of Christ's person. The author demonstrates that Jesus is vastly superior to the prophets, superior to the angels, and superior to Moses.
Establishing his identity first.
Yeah.
Got it.
Then, in chapters 5 through 10, the argument shifts to the superiority of his work. This is the deep theological exposition of Jesus as the great eternal high priest.
That's where we get into the heavy tabernacle stuff.
Exactly. Finally, chapters 11 through 13 move into the superiority of the Christian walk, focusing on practical exhortations, the nature of faith, and endurance in suffering.
So it's person, work, walk. That's a great outline. But I imagine for an audience that exhausted, just giving them 3 chapters of dense theology followed by 3 chapters of application wouldn't work. They'd tune out halfway through.
Oh, totally. And the author knows that. What makes Hebrews so rhetorically dynamic is its emotional and logical arc. The author weaves the theology and the application together using pivotal structural hinges.
Structural hinges, like what?
Specifically, they rely on Greek conjunctions like dio or un, which translate to therefore.
Ah, the famous therefores. How do they actually function in the flow of the sermon?
Well, the author will take you up into this soaring high Christology, this really deep exposition about the cosmic nature of who Jesus is. And just as your mind is completely blown by the theology, they drop a therefore and hit you with an urgent, visceral exhortation.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. In chapter 1, they prove Jesus is higher than the angels, quoting all these Old Testament texts. And then immediately in chapter 2, they say, therefore, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it.
Wow. It forces the theology to be intensely practical right in the moment.
Exactly.
It's never just, hey, here's an interesting metaphysical fact about the Son of God for you to ponder. Every time the author reveals something glorious, they grab the listener by the collar and say, because this is true, this is how you must live right now.
It generates this powerful rhetorical momentum. The clearer the supremacy of Christ becomes to the listener, the more compelling the call to hold fast to him becomes. But to even get them to listen in the first place, the author has to hook them.
Yeah, let's talk about the actual language, because I know the Greek in Hebrews is famous for being gorgeous. How does the author start the sermon?
They hook the audience with auditory elegance right from the first syllable. If you read the opening verse in Greek, it relies heavily on alliteration and rhythmic prose.
What does it sound like?
It starts. Polymeros kai polytropos palaitheos laisas.
Polymeros kai polythrop. Wow, you can hear the rhythm in that.
You really can. It means in many parts and in many ways, God spoke in the past. The repetition of those P sounds and the rhythmic cadence, it's designed to be heard. It commands the room's attention immediately.
It's like a poet taking the stage. And once they have the room quiet, they introduce this drum beat. There's a key word that basically defines the entire book, right?
The word is better. In Greek, it's kraton. It occurs 13 times throughout the text.
13 times. That's a huge motif.
It is. A better hope, a better covenant, better promises, a better sacrifice, a better country. The author is constantly, relentlessly contrasting what these Jewish Christians used to have under the Old Covenant with what they now have in Christ.
That brings up a fascinating philosophical concept the author uses. To prove that Christ is better, they use a specific literary device called typology. They talk a lot about shadows.
Yes. Typology is the engine of the author's argument. They use the Greek word skia, meaning shadow.
How does that work in the context of the Old Testament?
They look at the entire Old Covenant, the physical tabernacle with its gold and curtains, the bronze altar, the priests in their intricate garments, the rivers of animal blood, and they say all of that was profoundly important, but it was just a shadow.
Just a shadow. That almost sounds dismissive, but it's not, is it?
Not at all. It's acknowledging its purpose. It was a two-dimensional silhouette cast upon history by an approaching reality. And the substance, the actual physical, eternal reality that was casting the shadow all along, is Christ.
That is a total paradigm shift. I love the analogy of, it's like looking at a shadow of a tree on the sidewalk your whole life, and then finally looking up and seeing the tree itself.
Exactly.
Why would you ever go back to staring at the sidewalk once you've seen the actual tree?
You wouldn't. But here's the thing. If you are a terrified first-century Jewish Christian, clever Greek rhetoric and philosophical talk about shadows isn't going to stop you from abandoning your faith to save your family.
That's a good point. Rhetoric only goes so far when your life is on the line.
Right. You need proof from your own sacred texts. You need to know that God himself ordained this transition, and that's exactly what the author does next.
Which means we need to talk about intertextuality. The Old Testament is basically the foundation this entire sermon is built on, isn't it?
Hebrews quotes the Old Testament more than any other book in the New Testament, period. We are talking between 32 and 37 explicit, direct citations, along with dozens of subtle allusions and echoes that a Jewish audience would instantly recognize.
But they aren't just, cherry-picking random verses out of context to win a theological debate, right?
Yeah, not at all. The author operates with a very specific, deeply ingrained lens, what scholars call a Christocentric hermeneutic.
The Christocentric hermeneutic, so reading everything through the center of Christ.
Essentially, yes, they are reading the entire history of Israel through the lens of Jesus. It's a redemptive historical progression. They are demonstrating how every major institution in Israel's history, the kingship, the priesthood, the temple, the covenant itself, was inherently incomplete.
It was always pointing forward.
Always. It was all designed to reach its telos, its ultimate goal and fulfillment in the Messiah. Furthermore, they treat the Old Testament as the living, present voice of God.
You really notice that in the text. They rarely say God spoke to David in the past. They almost always phrase it as the Holy Spirit says, present tense.
Exactly. It is a living word for their present crisis. Let's look at how the author handles some of these key texts, starting with the juxtaposition of Psalms 2 and 8 in the first two chapters.
Okay, Psalm 2, that one is all about power and royalty, right?
Yes. In its original context, Psalm 2 is a royal coronation hymn. It celebrates the enthronement of the Davidic king, declaring, "You are my son, today I have become your father."
And the author applies that to Jesus.
Directly to Jesus. They use it to prove that Christ is the ultimate, eternal Davidic heir. His reign isn't just over a patch of land in the Middle East, it is cosmic. He is vastly superior to the angels.
But then, right after establishing this exalted, untouchable divine king, the author pivots to Psalm 8. And Psalm 8 has a very, very different tone.
It's completely different. Psalm 8 is a beautiful, almost melancholic poem about the lowered state of humanity. It says, "What is mankind that you are mindful of them, a son of man that you care for him? You made them a little lower than the angels."
It's very humble.
Yes. The author juxtaposes the royal, divine son of Psalm 2 with the humble, frail human of Psalm 8.
Why do that? I mean, why bring up human frailty right after talking about divine majesty? It seems a whiplash.
Because the author makes a profound theological observation. In Genesis, humanity was crowned with glory and honor and commanded to rule over creation. But because of the fall, we failed. The author of Hebrews writes, "Yet at present we do not see everything subject to them, but we do see Jesus."
Ah, we do see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, because he became human. He suffered death.
Exactly. By becoming human and tasting death, Christ recovers what Adam lost. He acts as the true human representative, the pioneer for the rest of humanity.
That is just, wow.
It's a deeply pastoral message for a suffering church, isn't it? Your king isn't sitting safely in heaven ignoring your pain. He entered the dirt and the blood and the suffering of the human experience.
That is incredibly comforting for people who are bleeding in the dirt themselves. But the author doesn't just use the Psalms to comfort them. They use them to deliver a really intense warning, too. Let's talk about Psalm 95, because the author becomes obsessed with one specific word from this text, today.
Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. The author repeats this over and over in chapters 3 and 4.
What is the historical background of that warning? Why would a Jewish audience find that so chilling?
Well, in Psalm 95, King David is looking back centuries to a tragic moment in Israel's history, the rebellion at Kadesh Barnea.
Kadesh Barnea. Set the scene for us.
The Israelites had just been miraculously freed from slavery in Egypt. They had seen the plagues, they had walked through the parting of the Red Sea, they were in the wilderness, standing right on the border of the Promised Land.
They were so close.
But when they heard the reports of giants in the land, they gave in to fear and unbelief. They refused to trust God.
And what was the consequence of that panic?
God swore an oath that they would not enter his rest, meaning the physical land of Canaan. That entire generation was forced to wander until they died in the wilderness. They saw the miracle of salvation, but they failed to endure to the end.
That is a terrifying story.
No.
So how does the author of Hebrews take that ancient wilderness history and apply it to a first-century house church in Rome?
They apply it typologically. The author points out a fascinating logical detail. Centuries after Joshua finally led the next generation of Israelites into the physical land of Canaan, King David wrote Psalm 95, still urging people, "Today, do not harden your hearts."
Wait, so if they were already in the land, why is David still talking about entering rest?
Exactly. That's the author's argument. If Joshua had given them true ultimate rest in Canaan, God wouldn't still be talking about another day of rest centuries later.
Oh, I see where you're going. The physical land of Israel was just another shadow.
Precisely. The physical land was a shadow of an eschatological Sabbath rest. This is the ultimate peace, the final, unbroken communion with God at the end of history. And Jesus is the greater Joshua. He is the one who actually leads his people into this true final rest.
But the warning of Kadesh Barnea still stands for the Roman Church.
That's the pastoral hook. The author is saying to them, you have been saved by the blood of the Lamb, just like the Israelites in Egypt. But right now you are in the wilderness of the Roman Empire. You are facing giants of persecution.
Don't turn back.
Right. Do not be like that ancient generation. Don't get right to the edge of ultimate salvation and then drift away in fear and unbelief. Today is the day to trust him.
That is brilliant. It makes the Old Testament feel incredibly urgent. But as masterful as that is, the author has a much more difficult theological puzzle to solve when they get to the central argument of the book, the priesthood.
Oh, yes.
And this requires us to unpack a guy named Melchizedek.
Psalm 110 and Genesis 14. This is without a doubt the most famous, complex, and crucial exegetical argument in the entire epistle to the Hebrews.
I have to admit, the first time I read Hebrews, I was completely baffled by this section.
Most people are.
Because the author spends multiple chapters meticulously arguing about Melchizedek. He's this random king who shows up for exactly 3 verses in the book of Genesis, gives Abraham some bread and wine, blesses him, takes a tithe, and then vanishes from the biblical narrative completely.
He's a blip on the radar.
He has no genealogy recorded, no backstory. Why on earth is he suddenly the linchpin of the New Testament?
It seems bizarre to modern readers, but you have to understand the massive, glaring theological problem the author of Hebrews was trying to solve. The entire goal of chapters 5 through 10 is to prove that Jesus is the ultimate high priest, the final mediator between God and humanity.
Right. But there is a massive legal barrier to that claim.
An insurmountable barrier under the Old Covenant. Under the law of Moses, to be a priest, you must be born into the tribe of Levi. Specifically, you have to be a descendant of Aaron.
It's genetic.
It was a strict, non-negotiable genetic requirement. If you aren't a Levite, you cannot serve at the altar. If you try, under Old Testament law, you could be struck dead.
And Jesus was legally from the tribe of Judah. He was from the royal Davidic line, not the priestly Levitical line.
Correct.
So by the strict rules of the Torah, Jesus is utterly disqualified from being a priest.
Exactly. So imagine you are a Jewish Christian in Rome, and you are drifting back to the synagogue. The local rabbi sits you down and says, how can you possibly trust this Jesus to forgive your sins? He isn't a Levite. He has no right to offer a sacrifice. The whole Christian claim is a fraud based on a violation of God's explicit law.
That is a really compelling counter-argument. How do you answer that?
Enter Melchizedek.
Okay, how does he fix this?
The author turns to Psalm 110. This is a universally recognized messianic prophecy. In it, God makes a solemn oath to the Messiah. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek.
Okay, so David mentions him.
Right. And the author of Hebrews takes that one verse and connects it back to Genesis 14 to that brief encounter with Abraham.
Who actually was Melchizedek? Because it feels like he comes out of nowhere.
Well, his name means king of righteousness, and he was the king of Salem, which means peace. More importantly, he was a priest of God most high centuries before the tribe of Levi even existed.
Wait, before Levi was even born?
Long before. The author of Hebrews notes that the Genesis text intentionally omits Melchizedek's genealogy, his birth or his death, and in the ancient Jewish method of interpretation, if something is omitted from the text, it's omitted for a theological reason.
Oh, I see. So his lack of a recorded genealogy makes him a type a shadow of a priest who has an eternal, unending life.
Exactly. He isn't a priest because of his genetics. He's a priest by divine appointment.
But how does the author prove that this Melchizedek guy is better than the Levitical priests? Because the Levites are the established system.
Through the ancient concept of corporate solidarity. In Genesis 14, Abraham, the patriarch of the entire Jewish nation, gives a tithe, a tenth of his spoils of war, to Melchizedek. And Melchizedek blesses Abraham.
Okay, so there's an exchange.
Yes, and the author states an undeniable axiom of ancient culture. The lesser person is always blessed by the greater person. Therefore, Melchizedek is greater than Abraham.
Okay, that makes sense. Abraham defers to him, so Melchizedek is higher up on the ladder. But how does that affect the Levites? They weren't even there.
Because of corporate solidarity. In the ancient Near Eastern mind, an ancestor embodies and represents all of their future descendants. So the author of Hebrews argues that Levi, the father of the Levitical priesthood, was still in the loins of his great-grandfather Abraham when Abraham met Melchizedek.
Oh, wow.
Therefore, the tribe of Levi effectively paid tithes to Melchizedek and submitted to his authority through Abraham.
That is, wow. So mathematically, genetically, and spiritually, the Melchizedek priesthood is vastly superior to the Levitical priesthood because the Levites basically bowed to Melchizedek before they even existed.
It is an absolute theological checkmate. It proves from the Jewish scriptures themselves that God always intended to replace the temporary genetic Levitical system with a permanent eternal priesthood based on an indestructible life.
Jesus isn't an illegal priest. He is a priest of a vastly superior, far more ancient order.
Exactly, and the author's logic is relentless. They argue if the priesthood changes, the law must change. The old system isn't just fulfilled, it's obsolete.
That is just a staggering piece of biblical interpretation. And it leads perfectly into the final major Old Testament text the author utilizes to seal the deal. Jeremiah 31, the New Covenant.
Yes. Jeremiah prophesied during the Babylonian exile, which was arguably the darkest period in Israel's history. The nation had utterly failed to keep the covenant made at Mount Sinai. But in the midst of that failure, God promises a new covenant.
And the author of Hebrews takes this ancient promise and says, this is what Jesus has inaugurated. What makes this new covenant so radically different from the old one?
Two fundamental things. First, the Old Covenant was written on stone tablets. It was external. It gave you rules, but it gave you no power to actually obey them.
It just condemned you when you broke them.
Exactly. But the New Covenant, God says, I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. It promises internal transformation by the Holy Spirit.
And the second difference?
Total, absolute forgiveness. Under the Old Covenant, sacrifices were a constant reminder of sin. But in the New Covenant, God declares, I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more.
So when you stack all of this together, Psalms 2 and 8 showing Jesus as the royal, sympathetic human, Psalm 95 showing him as the true Sabbath rest, Genesis 14 and Psalm 110 proving he's the eternal high priest, and Jeremiah 31 proving he brings a final internal covenant, it just builds this overwhelming, towering theological climax.
It's irrefutable. They aren't just giving a history lesson. They are meticulously proving the unquestionable supremacy of Jesus Christ.
So how does all this ancient textual work and Greek rhetoric actually translate into the core theology of the book? This brings us to what we might call the central nervous system of Hebrews, the theological and Christological synthesis. Who is Jesus, and what exactly did he do?
Well, the Christology of Hebrews is breathtaking. Let's look at how the author describes the divine nature of the Son right away in chapter 1. They use two incredibly precise, profound Greek words. First, the author says Jesus is the apogasma of God's glory.
Apogasma. What does that word capture?
It means the radiance, the outshining, the effulgence. Think of the sun in the sky and the rays of light it produces.
You can't have one without the other.
Exactly. You cannot separate the sun from its light. The light is the exact nature of the sun reaching us. Jesus is the eternal, inseparable radiance of the Father's glory.
And the second word?
He is the character of his being.
That sounds exactly like our English word character.
It's the etymological root of it. But in the ancient Greek world, a character was a very specific thing. It was the exact, flawless imprint made by a signet ring being pressed into hot wax, or the precise stamp minted onto a coin.
Oh, like an exact duplicate of the mole.
Yes. The author is saying that Jesus is the exact representation, the flawless, perfect imprint of the very nature and essence of God. To see the Son is to see the Father perfectly. There is no hidden, darker side of God behind the back of Jesus.
That is soaring, mind-bending metaphysics. But what I love so much about Hebrews is that it takes this cosmic, radiant, exalted Son of God and immediately grounds him in immense pastoral comfort.
Yes, the high priest connection.
Right. This glorious creator of the universe is also our sympathetic high priest.
And that reality is an absolute game changer for the human conscience. The author spends a lot of time diagnosing the fundamental flaw of the old Levitical system. It could never actually clear a guilty conscience.
Listening to you describe the mechanics of the old system earlier, it honestly sounds exhausting. The priest standing there day after day, slaughtering animals, splashing blood, it makes me picture someone on a spiritual treadmill.
A treadmill is the perfect modern analogy.
You sin, you bring a goat. You sin again, you bring a bull. The Day of Atonement comes, the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies, and the next day, you have to start all over again.
It never ends.
You are sweating, you are working, you are constantly anxious about whether you are clean enough,
Yeah.
but you're never actually moving forward.
Yeah.
Your conscience is never at peace because, deep down, the blood of a goat can't actually wash away moral guilt. It's just an endless performance.
It's a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. And what does Jesus do to the treadmill?
He walks in, offers himself as the perfect, spotless, willing sacrifice, and he shuts the treadmill down forever. The text says he did it once for all.
The Greek word there is ephipax. It means a singular, unrepeatable event of eternal consequence.
Ephipax. I love that. And the most beautiful, comforting phrase in the entire book is what Jesus does immediately after he makes that ephipax sacrifice.
He sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven.
He sat down. There were no chairs in the ancient tabernacle.
None. The priests never sat down because their work was never ever done.
But Jesus sat down. The work of atonement is utterly, completely, irrevocably finished.
It is the ultimate cosmic statement of rest. For a community being persecuted, feeling guilty, wondering if they need to go back to the temple and start offering sacrifices again to appease God, the author is saying, why would you go back to the treadmill? The creator of the universe shed his own blood for you. And then he sat down. The work is done. By one sacrifice, he has made perfect forever those who are being made holy.
But, and there's a massive but, in this book, we have to talk about the tension.
The warning passages.
Right, because while Hebrews contains arguably the most comforting assurance of salvation in the entire New Testament, it also contains the most terrifying, visceral warnings.
The solemn warnings against apostasy, they are deeply unsettling to read.
How are we supposed to balance this? Because you read chapter 6 or chapter 10, and it sounds like if you drift away or keep sinning deliberately, you can lose your salvation, and there's no sacrifice left for you, just a fearful expectation of judgment.
Right.
But then in chapter 7, you have this incredible ironclad assurance that Christ always lives to intercede for his people, and that he saves them completely.
The tension is very real, and conservative scholars debate the exact mechanics of it, but pastorally, the author uses this tension brilliantly. The warnings are designed to be a massive shock to the system.
Like smelling salts.
Exactly. They are meant to wake up a spiritually lethargic, drifting congregation. The author actually rebukes them sharply in chapter 5 with the famous milk to meat passage.
Oh, that is such a harsh pastoral rebuke. By this time, you ought to be teachers, but you need someone to teach you the elementary truths of God's word all over again. You need milk, not solid food.
The author isn't afraid to confront their spiritual immaturity. The tension works like this. The warnings reveal the deadly, catastrophic seriousness of treating the grace of God lightly. Apostasy, willfully turning away from the reality of Christ to go back to the shadows of the Old Covenant, is spiritual suicide. But the warnings are always, always anchored in the greater assurance of Christ's perfect priesthood. The goal of the warning isn't to make them live in cowering terror of God. The goal is to make them terrified of drifting away from God, so that they desperately cling to their high priest.
It's like the rip current. The warning passages of the lifeguard standing on the beach screaming through the megaphone, "Swim parallel to the shore, stop drifting, you are in mortal danger."
Yes.
The warning is terrifying. But the assurance is that the lifeguard is already in the water, swimming out with a rescue tube to pull you in.
That is an excellent way to synthesize it. The warning tells you the danger is real. The assurance tells you the rescuer is capable. And running toward that rescuer, holding on to him, is what the final movement of the sermon is all about, chapters 11 through 13.
This is where all this soaring cosmic theology hits the pavement of first-century Rome. Chapter 11 is world famous. It's universally known as the Hall of Faith.
The author meticulously surveys the heroes of the Old Testament. Noah building the ark, Abraham leaving his homeland, Moses rejecting the treasures of Egypt, Rahab hiding the spies.
All these people who risked everything.
Yes. But what is crucial here is how the author defines faith.
Because it clearly isn't just intellectual agreement, is it? It's not just checking a box on a theological survey.
No. Chapter 11, verse 1 defines faith as confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. Faith is active, relentless trust in the unseen promises of God, and it is proven by endurance.
Even when things look bleak.
Especially then. The author points out that many of these heroes died without ever receiving the physical fulfillment of the promises in their lifetimes. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. But they endured.
And because they endured, they now form what chapter 12 calls the great cloud of witnesses. I want to camp out on this imagery for a second, because for a first-century Roman audience, this would be visceral.
Oh, absolutely.
The author says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us." This is stadium imagery, isn't it?
It is explicitly drawn from the Greco-Roman athletic games, and terribly from the reality of the Roman amphitheater. Remember, this is a church that has seen believers martyred, perhaps in arenas just like the ones the author is evoking.
So the imagery is that we, the believers, are on the track. We are running a marathon. We are exhausted. Our lungs are burning. The Roman Empire is breathing down our necks, and we want to quit.
We want to walk off the track.
Right. But the stands of the stadium are packed to the rafters with this cloud of witnesses. And they aren't just passive spectators eating popcorn.
They are the veterans. They are the runners who have already completed their leg of the relay race. Abraham is there, Moses is there, David is there, and they are witnessing to the faithfulness of God.
But the author is very clear about where our focus should be. We don't look at the crowd. We don't look at our tired feet.
Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. You look at the finish line. You look at the one who already ran the ultimate race, endured the cross, scorned its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne.
And the author knows that running this race is going to hurt. They bring up a vital point regarding suffering. When these Jewish Christians were having their property confiscated, when they were being thrown into Roman dungeons, the overwhelming temptation was to think, God has abandoned us. He is punishing us. This is just random, chaotic cruelty.
It's the natural human response to pain. But the author quotes Proverbs 3 and completely reframes their paradigm of suffering. They explain it through the lens of a father's loving discipline.
Right. It's not the punishment of an angry judge. It's the training regimen of a loving father.
Exactly.
If you are running a marathon, the training is going to hurt. Your muscles are going to tear. You are going to be in pain. But your coach isn't putting you through that because he hates you. He's breaking you down to build the endurance you absolutely must have to finish the race.
The author says, endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. It transforms their senseless suffering into evidence of their divine sonship. It gives their pain a profound, eternal purpose.
It's such a shift in perspective.
It is. All of this, the elegant Greek rhetoric, the deep dives into the Old Testament, the warnings, the stadium imagery, it all lands in a deeply practical, deeply communal conclusion in chapter 13.
So how does this 2,000-year-old sermon to a terrified house church in Rome apply to a listener today? Based on this survey, what are the primary applications for ministry and for life?
Well, the first major application is a radical call to draw near, because the veil of the temple was torn in two, because Jesus offered himself ephapax. Once for all, you have unprecedented, bold access to the throne of grace.
Bold access.
Yes. Under the Old Covenant, you would be struck dead for approaching the presence of God casually. Now, you are commanded to approach God with confidence, to receive mercy and find grace in your time of need. You do not have to stand outside in fear.
And you don't do it alone. The second massive application is community. The author commands them to encourage one another daily. Why? So that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness.
You can't do it alone.
No, you can't survive the rip current of modern culture by yourself. If you try to swim alone, you will drift. You need a community of believers linking arms, keeping each other awake, speaking the truth to each other when the exhaustion sets in.
But the ultimate central message to take away from the book of Hebrews is this: rest in the finished work of Jesus Christ. You have been freed from the exhausting treadmill of performance-based religion.
You don't have to earn it.
You do not have to earn your forgiveness every day. The sacrifice is complete. When cultural pressures push you to compromise, when you are tempted to find your ultimate security in something visible, temporary, and earthly, look to what Hebrews calls the unshakable kingdom.
The unshakable kingdom.
Governments will fall. Economies will collapse. The things of this world can and will be shaken. Christ cannot be shaken.
That is incredibly freeing. And it leads me to a final thought I want to leave you with, circling all the way back to the tension we talked about at the beginning.
Yeah, let's bring it back to that.
The original audience of Hebrews was exhausted, and they were tempted to trade the invisible, radical reality of Christ for the comfortable, visible, legally protected shadows of the old temple system. They wanted something they could see, touch, and measure.
Which is human nature.
It is.
Yeah.
We might not be tempted to go sacrifice a goat at a physical altar today, but the human heart hasn't changed in 2,000 years. We still deeply crave visible security over invisible faith.
So true.
So the provocative question for you to mull over today is this: what are the lesser shadows in our modern world that you are currently tempted to settle for? Is it the illusion of political security, trusting a human party or a candidate to save you, instead of trusting an eternal king?
That's a big one.
Or is it the treadmill of performance-based morality, trying to prove your worth to God and others through your achievements, your resume, or your flawless social media feed? Or is it the desperate need for societal approval, subtly softening the sharp edges of your faith so you don't get mocked, canceled, or pushed to the margins of culture?
Those are all shadows.
Those things are shadows. They might look safe, they might look like a sturdy, reliable beach to stand on, but they are a rip current, slowly, silently pulling you away from the only reality that actually lasts. Don't trade the substance for the shadow.
The shadows will always fade. The substance remains forever. So as you face the pressures and the rip currents of your own life, whatever they may be, heed this ancient word of exhortation. Do not drift. Hold fast to your confession. And above all, fix your eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith.
Thanks for taking the plunge with us today. We'll see you on the next Deep Dive.